Robert Redford was 82 years old, quiet and calm throughout the interview. Then Jimmy told the story. Redford pushed his chair back, stood up, and everything changed. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. October 2018. Studios 6A at Rockefeller Center in New York City. The audience was electric with anticipation. Robert Redford, the Robert Redford, Hollywood legend, icon of American cinema, was sitting in the guest chair for what he'd announced would be one of his final television interviews before retirement. Jimmy was in his element. Charming, energetic, asking questions about Redford's incredible career. They'd been talking for maybe 8 minutes. Laughing about old movie sets. Sharing stories about directors and co-stars. It was exactly what everyone expected, a warm, nostalgic conversation with a living legend. Robert sat in the guest chair with the relaxed posture of someone who'd done 10,000 interviews. Elegant suit. That distinctive white hair. Those weathered, handsome features that had defined leading men for generations. He answered Jimmy's questions with practiced ease, occasionally smiling at memories from 60 years in film. Everything was going perfectly. Everything was safe. Everything was exactly what late-night television should be. Until Jimmy said, "You know, I have to tell you something. There's a story I've never told on this show. About my father. And it involves you." Robert's expression shifted slightly. Curious. Attentive. "My dad," Jimmy continued, his voice changing from his usual energetic host tone to something quieter, more personal. "He died in 2008. He was my hero. He wasn't famous. He wasn't in show business. He was a music teacher in Brooklyn. But he was the best man I've ever known." The audience quieted. This wasn't the Jimmy they were used to, the comedian, the impressionist, the guy who played games with celebrities. This was something else. "When I found out I was going to host The Tonight Show," Jimmy went on, "the first person I wanted to tell was my dad. But he was already sick by then. Cancer. And I remember sitting in his hospital room and he said to me, 'Jimmy, I'm so proud of you. But I need you to promise me something.'" Robert Redford hadn't moved. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were locked on Jimmy. He said, "Promise me that when you get that job, when you're sitting at that desk, you'll remember what matters. Not the fame. Not the celebrities. The people. The real people who watch your show because they need to laugh after a hard day." Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. The studio was completely silent now. "And then," Jimmy said, "my dad told me about the one time in his life when he met someone famous. He was in his 20s. 1974. He was teaching music at a public school in Brooklyn, making almost nothing, struggling to pay rent. And one Saturday he was in Central Park and he saw you." Jimmy stopped mid-story. The entire studio froze. Robert Redford's posture changed. He sat up straighter. His folded hands tightened. "My dad said you were just sitting on a bench," Jimmy continued, "reading a newspaper. And normally he would never approach anyone famous. He wasn't that kind of person. But something made him walk over. He said, 'Excuse me, Mr. Redford, I don't want to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you.'" Jimmy paused, composing himself. "And you know what my dad said you did?" Robert Redford was completely still. "You stood up. You shook his hand. You asked him his name. And when he told you he was a music teacher, you sat and talked with him for 20 minutes about teaching and why it mattered. You told him stories about teachers who had changed your life. You made him feel like what he did mattered." The cameras caught it, a single tear rolling down Robert Redford's weathered face. "My dad said that conversation kept him teaching for another 30 years, Jimmy said, his own voice breaking now. "Every time he wanted to quit because the pay was terrible, or the school system was broken, or he felt like nobody cared about music education anymore, he'd remember that Robert Redford, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, had taken 20 minutes to tell him that teaching mattered." Robert Redford's jaw clenched. His hands gripped the armrests of the guest chair. "I never got to thank you for that," Jimmy said quietly. "My dad died before I had the chance to tell you this story. But he made me promise that if I ever met you, I would tell you what that conversation meant to him. So, thank you for being kind to a music teacher in Central Park who just wanted to say hello." And then Robert Redford pushed his chair back. The sound of the chair scraping against the studio floor was shockingly loud in the silence. Redford stood up, not the casual standing of someone stretching, but the urgent movement of someone who couldn't sit anymore. Jimmy froze. His mouth opened slightly. His hands, which had been gesturing during the story, stopped midair. The audience gasped. Questlove's drumsticks hovered motionless. The cameras scrambled to adjust. Nobody knew what was happening. Robert Redford stood beside the guest chair, his 82-year-old frame suddenly looking powerful despite the years. Tears were streaming down his face now, not trying to hide them, not embarrassed by them. "What was your father's name?" Redford's voice cut through the studio, rough with emotion. "James," Jimmy said, barely above a whisper. "James Fallon. James Fallon," Redford repeated, like he was trying to place the memory from 44 years ago. "Music teacher. Brooklyn." "Yes." Redford shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile crossing his face. "I don't remember every conversation I've ever had. I wish I could tell you I remember that specific day. But Jimmy, I need you to understand something." He walked toward Jimmy's desk. The producers in the control room were going insane. Guests didn't walk toward the host's desk during interviews, but nobody stopped him. The cameras followed. Redford reached the desk and placed both hands on its wooden surface, looking directly at Jimmy. "I grew up poor," Redford said. "My mother worked multiple jobs. My father struggled with alcoholism. Teachers saved my life. Literally. They saw something in me when I was just an angry kid with no direction. They believed in me when nobody else did." His voice was shaking now. "When I became successful, I made a promise to myself that if anyone ever came up to me and told me they were a teacher, I would stop whatever I was doing and listen. Because teachers are the real heroes. Not actors. Not movie stars. Teachers." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The audience was crying. Not politely dabbing their eyes, actually crying. 300 strangers bearing witness to something that had transcended entertainment. "Your father," Redford continued, "was one of thousands of teachers I've talked to over the years. In parks, in restaurants, in airports. I don't remember all their names. But I remember why I did it. And Jimmy, I need you to know that he had it backwards." Jimmy's brow furrowed, confused. "He thought I was doing him a favor by talking to him," Redford explained. "But teachers like your father, they're the ones doing the world a favor. Every single day. For terrible pay and no recognition. Shaping lives. Changing futures. I just acknowledged what they were already doing." Redford reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small notebook, worn leather, clearly carried for years. He flipped through pages covered in his own handwriting. "I started keeping this after I turned 60, he said. "Every time I meet someone who tells me about their work, real work, not Hollywood work, I write down their name and what they do. I wanted to remember that there's a real world out there beyond the bubble of fame." He showed Jimmy a page. Even the cameras couldn't quite capture the handwriting, but the gesture was clear. "I'm going to add your father's name to this book," Redford said. "James Fallon. Music teacher. Brooklyn. 1974. The man who kept teaching for 30 more years because someone told him it mattered." Jimmy stood up now too, coming around from behind his desk. His carefully maintained host persona was completely gone, replaced by a son grieving his father, and meeting the man who had unknowingly shaped that father's life. "Can I ask you something?" Jimmy said, his voice barely steady. "Anything. Would you sign something for me? Something I could keep?" In my dad's memory? Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Redford nodded. What would you like me to sign? Jimmy looked around the studio. At his desk. At the cameras. At the audience. Then he reached up and began loosening his tie. This, Jimmy said, pulling the tie from around his neck. My dad gave me this tie. It was his favorite. He wore it to my college graduation, to my wedding, to the hospital on the day my daughters were born. I've worn it on this show more times than I can count. He handed the tie to Redford. Would you sign it? So that every time I wear it, I'll remember that the conversation you had with my dad mattered. That kindness matters. That taking 20 minutes to talk to a stranger can change their entire life. The studio erupted in applause. Not the enthusiastic applause of entertainment, the reverent, emotional applause of people witnessing something sacred. Redford took the tie with both hands like it was precious. He looked at Jimmy. Do you have a pen? Jimmy grabbed one from his desk. A simple ballpoint pen, nothing fancy, and handed it over. Robert Redford, legendary actor and director, sat down on the edge of Jimmy's desk and carefully wrote on the inside of the tie. His 82-year-old hand steady despite the tears still running down his face. When he finished, he stood and handed the tie back to Jimmy. Read it later, he said quietly. Not on camera. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Jimmy took the tie, nodded, and then did something that would be replayed millions of times. He stepped forward and embraced Robert Redford. Not a handshake. Not a polite hug for the cameras. A real embrace. Two men who had never met before tonight, connected by a music teacher from Brooklyn who had died 10 years earlier, holding each other while an audience and millions of viewers watched in tears. The cameras stayed on them. The band didn't play. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The moment simply existed, raw and real and completely unscripted. When they finally separated, Redford kept one hand on Jimmy's shoulder. Your father raised a good son, he said. He'd be proud of who you've become. Jimmy couldn't speak. He just nodded. Redford turned to the audience. I'm 82 years old, he said, his voice carrying through the studio. I've lived an incredible life. I've made movies I'm proud of. I've won awards. I've been blessed beyond measure. But you know what I hope my legacy is? He paused, looking out at the 300 faces watching him. I hope people remember that I stopped and listened. That I made time for teachers and nurses and firefighters and all the people doing real work in this world. Because that's what actually matters. Not the movies. The people. The audience stood. Every single person. Standing ovation that lasted for nearly 2 minutes. Jimmy and Redford stood together at the center of the stage while the applause washed over them. When it finally subsided, they returned to their seats, Jimmy behind his desk, Redford in the guest chair, but something had fundamentally changed. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, but it was different. More honest. More vulnerable. Jimmy asked questions he never asked in a normal interview. Redford answered with a candor he rarely showed. They talked about fathers and sons, about legacy and memory, about the moments that define a life. When the segment finally ended and they went to commercial, Redford stood to leave. But before he walked off stage, he stopped and turned back to Jimmy. Thank you, Redford said. For what? Jimmy asked, confused. I'm the one thanking you. For keeping your promise to your father. For telling me that story. For reminding me why I started doing this all those years ago. He walked off stage to thunderous applause. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show wrapped, Jimmy went to his dressing room and opened the tie to read what Redford had written. In careful handwriting it said, To James Fallon, the teacher who mattered. And to his son Jimmy, keep making your father proud. The best roles we play are the ones off-screen. RR. Jimmy had the tie framed. It hangs in his office at 30 Rock. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, James Fallon, 1948 to 2008. Music teacher. Hero. Dad. 3 months later, Robert Redford announced his retirement from acting. In his final interview, he mentioned that night on The Tonight Show and said it reminded him what he wanted his legacy to be. Not the films. The conversations. The moments when we stopped pretending and became human. Jimmy wears a replica of that tie on the anniversary of his father's death every year. And every time, he tells one story about a teacher who changed someone's life. Because kindness echoes across decades. And sometimes 20 minutes in Central Park can change everything.